Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I'm Janice Bauto from the Product Management and Marketing Group of Globe Business, and I'll be your host for this morning's activity. Welcome to our webinar entitled Zero Trust, a cybersecurity game changer that we are hosting together with our partners Checkpoint and Zscaler. There are, I think, 170 people as of now in attendance from across industries such as BPO, retail, manufacturing, FSI, and healthcare, among others, and many more are still trying to get in. So again, thank you, and we are really looking forward to have a productive session with you. Before we proceed, allow me to acknowledge the presence of some people, including Mr. Raymond Policarpio, our Vice President for Product Management and Marketing, Ms. Mean Kiambao, our Vice President for Corporate Sales, and Mr. Scott Robertson, the Vice President for Asia Pacific and Japan at Zscaler. Thank you so much for your support. We are extremely honored also to have with us today notable thought leaders and cybersecurity experts who will share with us insights about this concept called Zero Trust, why it is relevant now more than ever, and how you can actually adopt it in your own organization. Before we go on any further, I would like to call on the Vice President of Product Development and Engineering of Globe Business, Mr. Kokoy Claraval, to say a few words and introduce our first speaker.
Good morning, dear customers, partners, and colleagues. I see that we already have over, I believe, 200 attendees. That's very impressive. Thank you for giving us your time. We are very excited to host you for this morning's cybersecurity webinar on Zero Trust and how it is becoming such an important topic in today's times. I would like to introduce to you a colleague of mine, a seasoned security professional, having been a CISO for the past 10 years, with 7 of those in Globe. Just a little bit of trivia, this guy, during his younger years, was a rock star, literally. He had a metal band and was playing lead guitar. Sorry, Anton, if I had to share that, but you know, I love music too. To give our welcome remarks, may I introduce to you Mr. Anton Bonifacio, Chief Security Officer of Globe.
Hey folks, good morning. All right, just making sure, I guess everybody can hear me already. So first of all, I mean, again, thanks to EG for inviting me here. Maybe just a quick background, I guess, on what I'm handling for Globe. So for Globe, as Kokoy has mentioned, so I'm in charge of the entire end-to-end information security and data privacy. So we're not just a governance organization. So from governance to security operations to data privacy investigations to compliance. So for example, all Globe projects go through my team. To be able to ensure that things are secure or compliant, right? So that's roughly sometimes like 500 projects in a year. The team has grown over the past, I would say, 6-7 years. I think it all started with just like 18 people, and now we're close to 100. I guess the reason why the current topic too is close to my heart is because Zero Trust is not a new thing, right? I mean, Zero Trust as a concept has been there for a long time. Google started out with calling it Beyond Corp and whatnot. And it's something also that has a lot of different definitions. It has a lot of different explanations depending on who you're talking to, whether that's the Forrester who's the founder of Zero Trust, at least the consultant that was there, from Gartner, from different partners. But hopefully today that may shed some light for everybody, because now I'm sure, especially with COVID and the pandemic, all of a sudden Zero Trust is such a big thing, right? I guess the reason why it's also so important to Globe, I mean, we've been trying to adopt it, I think, for a while now in different ways. I think the main challenge for us as an organization is, when the pandemic hit, it's been 24/7 BAU for us, right? I mean, as a telco, nothing has really changed. And I think also now with, a lot of the different, I would say, whether that's quarantines or control, or as demand is coming back for everybody that are running businesses, whether, large corporates or SMEs, it is becoming more relevant, right? Especially, whether you're a BPO, whether you're in manufacturing, the need for remote work, I think, is most important. I think the greatest challenge in Zero Trust has generally been, how do you maintain that balance, right? And maybe if there's something I could share as a start is that, right? Zero Trust as a term sounds like, oh, you know what, this is like, crazy FBI, CIA stuff that you got to lock things down because you're not going to trust everybody. It's actually the complete opposite, right? Zero trust actually means finding that balance, right? Zero trust means that, okay, how do you now do secure connections, largely remote, in a balanced but secure manner, right? That we're trying to simplify things. We're trying to cull out the noise. That we're putting in a lot of contextual authentication and filtering to be able to really say, hey, you know what? We are going to start authenticating people, not so much so networks, not so much so just devices. So hopefully, the sessions today, both from Zscaler, both from Checkpoint, are going to be something that is going to be of great, I guess, mind-blowingly, hopefully unlock some things for you guys, right? Turns on not just one light bulb, but just all of the spotlights, because I do really think it's going to be a big help. That being said, I do believe that there's also going to be a panel later on, so I'll be more than happy to answer questions for you guys, how we implemented it, how we're leveraging some of the partners that we have here. And I'm just glad to see, really, as Kokoy has mentioned, like, 298, 300 people now, right? Just goes to show the criticality, and I think at the same time, just how important our industry has become, also over the past 3 months. So again, thanks a lot. I'm excited to interact with everybody within before the webinar ends. Thanks again.
Thank you, Anton. We look forward to more insights from you later during the panel discussion. Our next speaker has over 20 years of experience in the IT industry, focusing on various aspects of internet security and content delivery. He joined Zscaler in 2012 and is currently the chief architect for Zscaler's Asia-Pacific business based out of Singapore. Friends, let us all welcome Mr. Lee Dolsen.
Thank you, Janice, and thank you all for your time. I really appreciate the time to chat with you. Just let me share my screen, and we'll get started. So yeah, Anton's covered a couple of pertinent points here, so I'm excited to talk to you guys about our view and our take on this. A lot of what we've done follows there's similarities to what Google's done with BeyondCorp, which Anton mentioned. This goes back to, it's not a new definition. I mean, even before BeyondCorp, there was the Jericho Forum. There was, the Defense Department in the US defining how zero trust would look. So the idea goes back a couple decades now, but the really practical enterprise implementations have only really come to market in recent years. So I'm really excited to talk to you about our view of it. Let me talk just generally about the problem and the challenge with application access and the models that we've been working on as an industry for the last 20 years. Because we've been working generally as an industry with this castle and moat model where we trust users, and we're building our applications inside this trusted network. The users are inside that trusted network, and we're trusting everything that's inside that network. And what then happens is we're building a gateway, we're building various security components to go out from that network, outbound gateway for protecting related to internet threats, looking at what users are allowed to going out, but also looking at the data coming back in, lots of different security technologies there. And then also from a remote access perspective, a lot of investment in various technologies to get users or potentially customers or partners to your applications via remote access technologies, DMZ technologies, et cetera. But one of the key challenges here is this idea of if you're inside the network, you're trusted. And yeah, sure, maybe you can trust the employee that's sitting behind there, although that's a question mark that a lot of organizations have to look at too. To what degree do you trust the person? But it's not so much the person that's the problem. It's the fact that the whole model, security model, the internet itself is based on sort of trust. Any endpoint can talk to any other endpoint. If an attacker compromises this user inside your trusted network, that attacker is now inside your trusted network because that endpoint is inside and already inherently trusted to go anywhere. So we need to really think about what the journey looks like to move to zero trust. And a lot of this is actually tying in with the migration to cloud. So we've, in the last few years now, we're seeing applications rapidly move out of the traditional data center and they're moving into the cloud. So the cloud is the new data center. This is then driving people to look at their network models and looking at, how do I get my branches, my users to the cloud as fast as possible. The whole original purpose of building, the extended private networks was around getting users to the data center, but under that old model. But when the data center is now in the cloud, it's not to say the old data center isn't completely vanished, but more and more is shifting to the cloud. New companies, maybe 100% in the cloud. So we need to look at a different model around the security. So we really need to transform the security model. This is where secure access, service edge, and zero trust network access really come into play, because we're identifying who the user is, what are the resources they are allowed to connect to, what are the resources they are even allowed to see, and we're making the cloud be the broker to decide where users are allowed to go, what applications they're allowed to connect to. So with this, from a Zscaler perspective, we actually have two interrelated and technologies that work together. We have Zscaler Internet Access, which is really around protecting users as they're going to public apps, public SaaS, public internet. Inherently, all public apps, there is no concept of zero trust. They're advertised there on the internet. But certainly, the cloud can be leveraged as an access control point. You can lock many of the public SaaS apps down. You can control your managed endpoints to say, hey, these endpoints can only go to the cloud before they're allowed to go to those. Zscaler Internet Access is all around those. We're going to focus a little less on that today, but just to understand how Zscaler positions our technologies. That's Zscaler Internet Access for protecting public SaaS, public internet. But what we're really going to focus on today is the right half of the screen there with Zscaler Private Access. So this is around your internal apps and that traditional model I talked about in the beginning, where if users are inside the castle, they're allowed to go to the apps. And now in this world we are, the castle is moving into the cloud. In this situation where many of us are today, or most of us, if not all of us, working the majority of our time from home, the traditional model has really changed, where we've got to look at what does that mean for users that are working from home, they're working from networks you don't manage. How do I make sure that my apps are secure? How do I get the users to those apps securely without exposing my entire network to attackers, because I can't secure the network that user is working from? So this is where Zscaler Private Access comes in. This is replacing a lot of that remote access technology, and that's what we're going to drill into from here. So, more and more users are accessing services from outside the enterprise. So this was a trend it's already been happening for years with the rise of 4G, 5G, the adoption of cloud just enables users to work from networks that are not yours. So, how do I look at security when users are working from other networks? Likewise, the cloud applications where they're hosted, those are also networks that are not your networks. For many organizations, we're seeing more and more unmanaged devices than managed devices. So how do I deal with this security model for unmanaged devices? And again, like I said, apps, they're not inside the network. You're not managing the network when they're on a cloud provider's network. Still responsible for the security, but trying to apply legacy security models to networks that you don't manage is very challenging. The traditional network security is built around that original idea of the castle and moat. I'm building my network as my castle. I'm putting traditional security in the castle, at the edge of the castle. But when the castle, users aren't in the castle, the apps aren't in the castle, trying to continue to use that model is very challenging. And it's very challenging for users if you're trying to use that as well, which we'll get into. I mean, I think users using traditional VPN, I think we've all had this experience. When I joined Zscaler, I've been with Zscaler now for 8 years. We launched Zscaler Private Access, I believe it was 2016. But prior to that, we did use traditional VPN, and it was the worst. I hated when I had to connect to the corporate network or the couple of apps that we had sitting in our corporate office. It was extremely painful. And for very large organizations, it can be even more painful than my experience, because you may have VPN concentrators around the world. You may have different VPN profiles for different use cases. One challenge we see with COVID is many users that never had to use VPN before, suddenly they've got to add VPN into their workflow and how they engage at home. It's a big challenge. And there are multiple other challenges associated with this. It's a complicated stack of infrastructure, as you'll see from this picture. You may have global load balancing if you've got multiple gateways around the world. DDoS is something that many people look at because this is an attack surface that you need to protect. And then multiple layers of firewalls and segmentation and a lot of complexity around there. And when we're dealing with this situation where we are today, we've got to scale this up. In many environments, this was sized for 20 or 30% of the workforce accessing it intermittently. And suddenly we're in a place where we have 80 to 100% of the workforce needing to use these services. And scaling it up is very challenging. Very difficult operationally and physically to deploy that capacity. We've got the user experience, which I just talked about. It's painful for users. And then when we add cloud into that mix, typically the way things are going into the cloud in a lot of environments is the traditional data center has a direct connect or express route or some sort of connectivity to the cloud, which is where they get to your apps, whether they're in AWS, Azure, or Google Cloud, or wherever you might have them. But then the user experience, users working from home, they're working remotely, they're in the cloud already, but instead they've got to go to the traditional data center, go through that security infrastructure, go over this site-to-site connection then to get to the application, which is in the cloud. So that's not a good user experience. And this is still perpetuating the original challenge I talked about, where this traditional VPN model is leveraging network access. So I'm allowing the user inside the castle using VPN connectivity. Once they're inside the castle, they have an IP address inside the castle. And if you're using split tunnel, which many organizations are, especially in these times with COVID, adding internet traffic to this is a big challenge just from a pure capacity perspective, not to mention the security side of things. So if this is a split tunnel, that user then has unfettered internet access and potentially attackers remote controlling them from that network, from their home network or whatever network they might be on. Now that attacker is on your network because that user has IP access, they're inside the castle, they're treated the same as they were when they were sitting physically in the office. So the attack surface is now extended into the cloud as well. So this is a challenging model from that perspective. The other thing we're seeing, especially, again, with COVID, people looking at strategies for how do I expand this? Okay, the traditional VPN model isn't working for me. Let me take the traditional security model and expand this into the cloud. I'll build VPN infrastructure in my different cloud environments. I'll build firewall infrastructure in my different cloud environments. I'll expose applications there. So here you're increasing the attack surface in a different way. Now you're increasing your public attack surface. You're exposing more points on the internet. You've got more operational controls that you need to think about in each of these environments because now they're exposed to the internet. So it's a bigger threat landscape. It's more attack surface, it's more complexity. Depending on the approach you've taken, either you've got VPN concentrators now exposed in multiple places, or you've directly exposed your internal apps to the internet so you can bypass VPNs, but now they're directly exposed to attackers as well. And because of the additional complexity, if something does go wrong, there are so many more operational control points here. It's a much bigger challenge to try to isolate where is the problem, what do I need to do to fix it. So this is really, the journey from VPN to ZTNA was looking at these different ways of doing things. The traditional model I talked about, we backhaul everything through the traditional DC where I've got the control point. That's not working. Expanding my traditional model into the cloud, that really doesn't work. So that's really where zero trust network access comes in, where I use ZTNA or SASE technologies to get everything to the cloud. My data centers go to the cloud, my users go to the cloud. I make my decisions there about where things are going to. And when we talk about different analysts and things, a lot of the models we're talking about here really follow Gartner's definitions of ZTNA. Gartner's forecasting, more than 60% of enterprises will be moving to this by 2023. I actually think it's probably, at least for many use cases, going to be even faster than that. based on what we're already seeing in the market. So when we talk about Gartner's perspective here, and you can go and check out the Gartner paper, a few different things Gartner talks about. One is private apps, they can't be visible on the internet. They've got to be dark. The cloud is the broker then between the users and the apps. And so it's outbound connections to the cloud instead of inbound connections to your data center. And users don't need to be on the corporate network. So we're moving to identity and managed devices versus unmanaged. We can make different decisions for managed versus unmanaged, but we're using identity and context of the type of device to decide what type of connectivity to the application a user will get. So let's talk about what this means for Zscaler. So like I talked about earlier, the inherent problem with the internet, it was pretty sure it was designed by Star Trek fans. If you think about the era, it was that time where the utopia, we thought this utopia was around the corner and we'd be living in this future. And if you think about the internet, it's inherently any endpoint can talk to any other endpoint. There's an inherent sort of goodness assumed in the way networking was designed. There is no inherent security overlay. It's a lot like phones today, any endpoint can talk to any other endpoint. So if we think about the zero trust model, we try to look like an analog in the real world that fits. It's actually the early days of phones that actually fits very well. So in the early days of phones, they were very special, they were expensive, and it required a physical person. So you would call up and you might be on a party line or something like that, but you'd be calling up to a switchboard. There would be a physical person at that switchboard that would check who you are, and do you have a contract to make a call to where you want to go? Are the right contracts in place? And if so, that switchboard operator would literally plug in cables together to connect you to the third party. And so, this is kind of similar, very similar to the idea of zero trust. What we're doing is we're moving this model to the cloud. If you think about any network connection, it's very similar to a phone call. I want to connect as a user. I want to connect to an application. I want to make a phone call to that application. So we use the cloud to identify who that user is, what type of device are they connecting to. We look at the contracts, the policies that are in place for that user. Are they allowed to connect to that application? If the policies are there, if the user is allowed to connect to that application, we're not allowing them on the remote network. Instead, the network where the application is hosted, we're going to stitch together a cable, just like that telephone operator, to allow that connection to happen. So what we're doing with this model, like we talked about with Gartner's ideas, we're eliminating the traditional remote access infrastructure. And you see these blue icons in this diagram. This represents a Zscaler component that would go into your data center called a connector. These essentially allow your data centers to go dark for both your users and potential third parties. No one can see what's in your data center. No one can explore your data center. Everything in your data center is completely invisible to your users and third parties. And it's only if a user is allowed to access an application, is that connection allowed to happen. So it's inside out connections where your data centers connect to the cloud, your users connect to the cloud. The user never needs to be on the network. So we've taken away network access, and it's all outbound. So users, all these things Gartner said are all delivered by this technology. So if you think about this, when we go back to the firewall model, it's very, very different, where firewalls, you're basically advertising services, whether those are VPN services, whether those are directly exposing the applications in a DMZ. Essentially, firewalls technology, that legacy approach is saying, hey, I've got an application here, people can connect to it. Users are trying to connect and the firewall gets them there. With the zero trust model, nothing's advertised. Your user only talks to Zscaler, your data centers only talk to Zscaler, and only if the user is allowed to connect to that application is that application exposed to that user, and only that application. So if we talk about the use cases here, so one use case, of course, is replacing or augmenting your existing VPNs. It's often not necessarily the first use case when people explore this. A much bigger use case is actually as apps move into the cloud, and that's something we're seeing with COVID as well, is people looking, okay, how do I move more stuff into the cloud to enhance my workforce's ability to work remotely, because this isn't going to change anytime soon. So, we talked about BeyondCorp before. BeyondCorp actually is a very similar model, but it's focused only on Google Cloud. Amazon and Azure, every cloud provider, or most of them, actually have a similar technology. But the challenge is these technologies are exclusive to their clouds. So if you use BeyondCorp, you can only use that with a GCP developed app. If you use the AWS version, you can only use that with AWS. What's nice about doing it with Zscaler is we are agnostic to the clouds. We peer with all the different cloud providers. We have good connectivity to all of them. Our Zero Trust is sitting in there, but this is agnostic to all clouds as well as your traditional DC. So it can bridge the gap from traditional data centers as well as across all the different clouds. So if you are investing in multiple clouds to make sure your eggs aren't in one basket, it can be there. Another use case for this is accelerating M&A, because I don't need to connect networks. I can connect users to apps instead of connecting networks. And then of course, the really simple low-hanging fruit for this technology, when you're giving business partners or potentially even customers exposing apps, you can minimize advertising those apps in a traditional DMZ model and have them advertised only via Zero Trust. And then, the other thing that people are doing is moving beyond remote access for Zero Trust and actually looking at Zero Trust inside the network, where I actually separate my users from my applications all the time, not just for remote access, but even when they're on the network, because that attack surface is still there. That trust model is still a problem for the traditional network as well. And so then all these capabilities are available. I'm not going to go into these in the interest of time. But the benefits here is this is a 100% cloud native, cloud delivered architecture. It's fully scalable and elastic, so it's as ready as soon as you are. It's built to be very seamless to the users. As an agent runs in the background, or for customers or partners, you can expose that namespace in those specific use cases for those places where you don't want an agent. But it's built to be very seamless and easy to use for a user. It's just, they don't know whether an application is hosted behind Zero Trust. If they're a trusted user, they can get access to that application. And then, we're optimizing costs. We're moving a lot of the operational costs away. We're moving a lot of the traditional costs around physical appliances away as well. So a lot of benefits on that. And we'll be happy to talk about more questions during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Lee. Before I turn you over to the next speaker, I'd like to inform everyone that if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A box, and we will answer them. Well, the speakers will answer them later during the panel discussion. So our next speaker is the Chief Technology Officer for Asia Pacific and Japan at Checkpoint Software Technologies. In this role, he acts as a trusted advisor to C-level audiences and provides thought leadership regarding the challenges that cyber attacks pose to business. Let us all welcome Mr. Tony Jarvis.
Okay, thank you everybody. Really happy to be here. Some familiar faces, some good friends, and a whole lot more. We've got 300 plus people, which is fantastic. So I'm talking today a little extension about Zero Trust, focusing on the endpoint. Now, I'm cognizant of the fact that we have multiple vendors presenting today. Each vendor has their own view on the world, and out of a gentleman's agreement, I'm focusing solely on endpoint. So endpoint can cover a lot of things. We're going to look specifically at the laptops and so forth that you'd see working from home in work from home situations. And I believe I've got roughly about 20 minutes. So in the interest of time, I'm going to go and share my screen. Bear with me here. Okay, so we should have a screen up, and I'm going to dive in. Let's get started. So Zero Trust on the endpoints. Let's start by taking a quick recap on where we are and how we got here. Speaking specifically with regard to events this year, certainly the early stage of this year. So we know with regards to COVID-19 and businesses needing to pivot to the majority or the entirety of their workforce no longer being in a physical office. It really has caught a lot of businesses out by surprise. So we see a lot of businesses did have policies. I mean, they had policies regarding bring your own devices, and they would allow this connectivity. But the connectivity was only a single element. There was no security attached to that connectivity. And that's where things really fell down. So that was a surprise. And a lot of businesses have suffered data breaches as a result of this. The security has suffered. But we also know that attackers are not standing still. They're not waiting for businesses to go out and put their security in place. They're really taking advantage of the opportunity. They're not doing anything really sophisticated. What they're effectively doing is just ramping up the scale of their operation. So they know this is a unique opportunity, it's a once in a blue moon opportunity for them. They are significantly increasing the scale of their attacks simply to try to cast their net as wide as possible and take advantage of the vulnerabilities we're seeing with a lot of unprotected endpoints and devices. And it's working, it's paying off for them. There has been a lot of talk, and this is very true, around the need for embedding security into an organization's culture. This is true now more than ever. Employees need to be aware what the security policies are, why it's important, and really distill it down into the bare basics. What are the top 2 or 3 things they need to look out for on a daily basis that really do wonders for them in terms of improving the security, the bottom line there for the organizations? And if that's something that's communicated in an effective manner, we really do bolster that human element, which is always critical when we're talking about security here. And of course, as we're discussing today, we're also talking about zero trust. Zero trust, the previous speaker mentioned, has been around for a long time, and certainly the last year or two has become more widely discussed, certainly more of a topical item on the agenda for discussion. So that's really what we're diving into today. Now, what have most organizations been doing trying to respond to this current situation? Well, getting connectivity up and running. Really, most of them have been focusing on getting business working rather than getting business secure and safe. And that means, checking you've got the necessary bandwidth, deploying agents if you can, really just enabling people to do their job. And security sort of came second. A lot of them are looking at that now. They still do focus on protecting the perimeter. We've got, everybody runs their next generation firewalls. I don't think anybody's immune to that. But for a lot of organizations, they have assumed for a long time, because they have those gateways, that just automatically means everything in the organization is safe. And of course, things will move around, will connect from coffee shops and insecure Wi-Fi and what have you. Certainly isn't the case. And really, this year has shined a spotlight on that. And really no surprise to all of us that have been in security for a while, but the figures do tell us that 3/4 of organizations didn't really have a business continuity plan that had been regularly tested going into this, which is why we're all sort of struggling. What do we do? We sort of discussed this once or twice, but it's not really well oiled, and we're sort of going through it step by step. So 1/4 of those don't actually have business continuity plans at all. So you can see the need for change here. So what does this mean? What's the outcome at the end of the day? Well, for most organizations, and I travel around all of Asia Pacific, I talk to a lot of different organizations, and this is true for the majority, they will have some sort of basic security on their endpoints. And when I say basic, you can think antivirus. There are others, you've got IPS and that sort of thing, but effectively we're talking basic signature-based security. We know this is a bad file because it matches a file we've seen before. And then in the office, we've got next generation firewalls. And they add an element of security. It's a multi-layered sort of system. But the trouble is, you've got this security gap. What about the files you've never seen before? What about 0 days, unknown malware, mutated malware, that sort of thing? But take the next generation firewall out of the equation, which is true at the moment when we're working from home, and you've got an even bigger problem. So what do we do about that? Well, this is where we start talking about zero trust. And I'm not really going to go into the details of zero trust, because safe to say most people on this call would have a general sort of understanding. It's really, if I was going to put it in a single sentence, it's really principle of least privilege. You want to be authenticating every step of the way. It's not one and done or set and forget. Anytime there's a request for a service, anytime there's something being accessed, you want to know who it is, why, should they be doing that, and certainly don't allow it if that's not the case. So you can see the snippets here from the news. It is important. A lot of organizations, and we see figures like this all the time in security. You'll see 66% here of people saying, yeah, we're doing this. But when you really sort of peel back the covers and have a look, are they? So there's often a difference between what people think that might be the case in terms of security, and we see this with things like shadow IT, for example, and what really goes on. So I think there is a greater need here to really sort of bolster the zero trust than what we're seeing in terms of the statistics, and certainly something that's being discussed this year in some detail. So how does it look? Keeping it nice and simple, our view of the world is you really want to spread zero trust around everything you've got in terms of assets across your enterprise. So that includes obviously your devices, obviously your people, their core components, but also your workloads, things like containers, for example, across the network that's not going away. Data is, you've got to be encrypting, you've got to, who's accessing your data, and automating and getting visibility. What is happening, where is it? I want to know in a dashboard, very easy to follow through. So you can see the details on the left here. I'm not going to belabor the point, but really what you want to do is make this efficient so there's no gaps involved, because gaps have been sort of those security gaps and issues, the visibility that we've seen in the past, and really focus on prevention. And that's a core focus for us as a vendor. Yes, we do detection, everybody does detection, but our core focus is prevention. So we really only want to be detecting after the fact in terms of, the exception case. And for most of those cases, we want to be preventing anything from happening so that you don't have a mess to clean up, such as ransomware and encrypted files. So that's sort of our lay of the land, how we see the world. And let's just focus now on endpoint as the technology set in terms of security. So what does it look like? Well, endpoint really includes a number of things. You can talk about laptops, you can talk about mobile devices. For the sake of simplicity, cramming this into 20 minutes, I'm just going to talk about laptops, but there certainly are mobile solutions. That's something we offer. But if we're looking at laptops, what does that mean? Well, you want to have all of your protections against the threats involved there. That's your anti-malware, certainly your phishing. Phishing is the biggest threat we're seeing right now in terms of numbers. And take the numbers with a grain of salt, because depending on the report, the vendor, the time it's published, these statistics are going to change on a daily basis. But we're seeing on average, if you take all of the statistics and you average them all out, we're seeing roughly about a 14,000% increase in phishing emails taken from, say roughly April, May this year, compared to January, the start of the year. So the numbers really are ramping up. And you want all of your protections there. In terms of whatever the threats are, you want to have some sort of protection that's going to remediate that, block it, prevent it, ideally. So we can inspect these devices, see if there's a malware infection. If we're talking about mobile devices, has that been jailbroken, for example? We have that visibility, and don't let anything onto the network unless it satisfies your security criteria. Does it have antivirus installed, for example? Does it have encryption on the file system? So we can do all of this. There is an IoT element. I'm not going to go into that. I'm going to save the time here, but we also see that the traditional network-based solutions, your threat emulation, your extraction, we'll talk about those in a bit, that's also true for endpoint, and they carry across one-to-one parity to the endpoint there. So that's really our take on endpoint in terms of security. And what this means, if you look at the individual protections, because I mentioned you want to have a number of protections keeping you safe, well, it's two parts. So you want to protect against the things that you have seen before. And this means, looking at file signatures, looking at reputations of things. And this is mature. This is mature technology, certainly been around for quite a while. But then we supplement that with, what about things that we haven't seen before? And there's a whole bunch of different ways of doing this. We have a number of independent custom-built engines, a lot of those using AI, to look for specific types of threats. So for example, we can look at ransomware as a specific threat and look at lots of cases of ransomware, the similarities, observe the file system, note any sort of encryption activity, and it's a very, very good, effective prevention. There's a number of other things here too. We can look at types of malware families, and even if something doesn't match something we've seen before, because it shares commonalities in the behavior and the types of things we see it doing, well, then it's going to tip us off that this is so similar to something that's not a great thing you want on your endpoint. We're probably going to block this one as well. So it's your known as well as your next generation sort of antivirus protections as well. And of course, we've got over 20, and this number is growing all the time, over 20 custom-built engines specifically focusing on those 0 days. And the 0 days really are what catches a lot of organizations out, that they might think they've got protections, and those protections just don't catch those 0 days because it's nothing you've seen before. So you're really shooting in the dark unless you've got these newer advanced technologies keeping you safe. So I mentioned emulation and extraction. What does that mean? I'm going to keep it really, really simple here. Threat emulation is effectively sandboxing. Now, sandboxing is nothing new. It's been around for a while. And just like there are next generation firewalls, there are next generation sandboxes. The older sandboxes are prone to what we call sandbox evasion techniques. So malware has ways of figuring out if it's being run in a sandbox, and it can employ some tricks to get around that and not do anything malicious so it doesn't get picked up. We do CPU level emulation. It's hardware-based emulation that really is evasion resistant. So it means you are getting the proper protection. You see exactly what's happening in terms of the malware side of things. But if that takes 2 or 3 minutes to emulate a file, you don't want a user sitting there waiting to download a file. They need that file right now. So this is where extraction comes into play. Extraction is simply taking a file or a document, taking anything that could potentially be malicious out of that file. This is scripts, macros, anything that's basically dynamic in nature, and flattening or sanitizing that file, giving that to the user. So they get what they need to work straight away. If they want the access to the original file, which 99% of the time they never need, they can self-serve that request, no help desk involved, and once the file has been emulated, we know it's free of threats, they get that delivered straight to their inbox. That's all good. So that's threat emulation and extraction. Now, we also know that the biggest threats we're seeing right now is really one, phishing. And that's where we have custom anti-phishing protections. This is what's stopping a lot of those phishing emails getting in. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on here. Effectively, what's happening is we're looking at the site where a link might be taking the user, doing a lot of checking, not just reputation, not just, whitelists or blacklists, for example, but we are looking at behaviors. We're seeing commonalities. We're seeing what are the elements that make up this page? How similar are they to other pages or known malicious sort of content? And if we see something deceptive, we will block the access to that site. That's going to keep the user safe. They won't be able to put in their personal information into a site that's going to a malicious threat actor. So anti-phishing, but also ransomware. A lot of organizations are being caught out by ransomware. Interesting statistic, the typical ransom request right now is lower than it usually has been because organizations aren't in a position to pay the amounts that they were paying before due to COVID-19. But the volume of ransomware attacks has increased. So it's a numbers game. Attackers are trying to catch a lot more people out, getting a slightly lower payout, but effectively making the same or more profit overall. So ransomware for us, we have very specific protections. This is a core product in itself for us, one that we've been running for over a year, very mature. And if you look at the testing, you always want to look at testing, whether it's Gartner, Forrester, whoever. Do check it out because it is probably, I would be very, very comfortable in recommending whatever's happening on your file system. Just seeing a file get encrypted doesn't really tell you it's a ransomware attack. That can be a very typical user behavior. But there's so many different elements you want to join the dots here and see what's happening. So that's something that we do look very, very closely at the end-to-end operation, connecting all of those dots and seeing what's happening at the file system level. So what is the checkpoint difference here? This is really interesting. I'm quite passionate about this because if you look at a typical situation with malware arriving on a machine, you're probably going to pick that up, hopefully, with some sort of antivirus. And that's where a lot of products, that's their meat and potatoes. That's what they do. But maybe it's a 0 day. And hopefully, if you've got a next generation AV, well, you might also pick that up. Great, no problem. But how did that malware get onto the machine? Maybe it turns out it was delivered by a PowerShell script on a Windows machine. And maybe that PowerShell script was initiated by a command line. And then perhaps that command line was run by some macro sitting in a Word document. And then that Word document was downloaded from the web. Now, here's the interesting bit. If you run the traditional sort of protections, and certainly what makes up the majority of the market, you're going to see the stuff that triggered the alerts by the protection you've got that's looking for those behaviors. And that's where it stops. And then you might remediate that, but an hour later you get the same threat come back. What we do is we look at the entire chain. We trace it right back to the source of origin. How did it get onto the machine? What did it do? Where did it move? Everything relating to that behavior. And you actually get a flowchart showing the exact story of this particular attack. So what that means for us is we see every element in that chain. We're able to quarantine, block, and put in protections to protect all of those processes. So you're really getting system-wide, enterprise-wide visibility when we talk about a specific type of malware attack here. And that really is the difference. It's all about visibility, because obviously if you can't see it, you can't protect it. And that's the focus for us. So endpoint, we know, sort of wrapping up here, is a really, really big thing a lot of organizations need to be looking at now. You might have network-based solutions. You might be going through some sort of gateway and filtering traffic in that regard. But there are things on the endpoint that you will only ever see on the endpoint. And that's why you need the protections here. Take, for example, remote workers. They may not be doing everything they need to do through their normal course of operations through the day, going through some sort of tunnel or some area where you've got system visibility. It might just be limited to that machine. Maybe they're copying files to and from removable media. And if they're doing that, well, those files aren't going to go through your gateways. You're not going to see that anywhere else. So you want protections on the endpoint. If malware lands on an endpoint, modern malware does not want to stay in one place. It wants to spread. It wants to propagate. We call that lateral movement. And that may or may not pass through areas of your network where you've got visibility or gateways, for example. So again, you want protections on the endpoints. And then, of course, if you're downloading content, and maybe that's encrypted, and so it's only really pieced together and you can inspect it once that reassembling has finished, well, that's on the endpoint. You might see fragments, but those fragments are going to be encrypted between the two different endpoints during the download. So you want the endpoint protection. And this is really a long-term play now. We know that, and this is sort of going back a bit now, there's been a lot more companies jump into the mix and say, we're going to do that too. But companies like Google and Facebook and Twitter here, they're either saying that remote work is now a core thing for either the remainder of this year or indefinitely. So yes, we're going to go back to the office. It's not going to be every day. It's not going to be every worker. There is going to be a certain amount of this that carries over to what people are labeling as the new norm. And remote workforces are a core part of the modern workforce. And it's not a case of you protect the office and you've protected your user base. So closing thoughts, just wrapping up here. What does this all mean? We do need to rethink our architectures. I mean, zero trust is a real thing. It's of benefit to organizations. You cannot just assume that because somebody is internal in your network, you can trust it. So you want to be knowing who the user is, what the machine is they're on, what sort of groups they belong to, what access policies those groups have, and constantly be inspecting and validating. So that's the important thing. I would recommend, because a lot of people ask me, well, look, how do we go from where we are now to zero trust? And it's not an overnight switch. It's more a long-term play. My general advice is whatever security policies you're doing, maybe it's a refresh, maybe it's adding some functionality. As you're changing, and security is constantly evolving, we're constantly putting in new things, replacing old things and upgrading. As you're doing that, make sure whatever you're putting in is in line with zero trust principles. And that will constantly get you closer to ultimately where you want to be. And then, of course, you're not in this alone. There's a great support network in the security industry. Vendors, yes. Partners, yes. There's so many different people you can talk to get their thoughts, their advice and expertise in terms of, we've seen this before, this is what a certain customer in your position did, it worked for them, it's a general best practice. And that's how you get the sense of, well, this is really working for a lot of organizations. So it's something we could potentially look at. Every organization is unique. Every security policy is unique. We've all got different budgets, different size organizations, different geographic locations, but take all of the advice, run it through the filters of what works for your specific use case, and then make your decision about how you want to make those steps forward. So that's really my take on Endpoint. Certainly happy to take any questions, which will probably come up in the panel. And I'm going to hand back now because I know we've got some panel discussions and some other activities to look forward to. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Tony. I hope after the two presentations, our participants learned a thing or two about how they can better protect users and devices against cyber attacks that are getting increasingly complex, pervasive, and aggressive, actually. But of course, we would like to further pick the brains of our experts. So now we would like to go to the panel discussion. Our panelists include our speakers, Mr. Anton Bonifacio, Mr. Lee Dolsen, and Mr. Tony Jarvis, who will also be joined by the Senior Vice President at Globe Business, Mr. Peter Maquera. We also would like to welcome Mr. Marlon Cruz, the Director for Solution Sales for Cybersecurity at Globe Business, to moderate the discussion.
Yes, thank you, Janice. Thank you, distinguished panelists. Good morning, Ka-Globe. Good morning to our dear customers. Okay, so just type in your questions and we'll make sure that in the next 35 minutes, we'll respond to all your questions. Okay, so to summarize all the points that was mentioned by Anton, Lee, and Tony. I think Zscaler and Checkpoint made a very good point of the traditional network, okay? Meaning we used to have a circle of trust, that we have defined a security perimeter, that when we do our scanning, we only scan the north and south traffic of threats. But because of of the landscape, we talk about the dynamic roaming workspace, the wide adoption in SaaS application, the migration to IaaS infrastructure. So trusting the perimeter is not enough. Okay, I think both Lee and Tony made a very good point that right now, when you look at the attacks, okay, it involves already multi-vector, zero-day attacks. But if you look the cyber posture of our client and the companies, it's still on the basic and it's still on the reactive. Anton made a very good point of finding the right balance, securing a connection in a wide manner, securing not only the devices, but securing the people and having the visibility and the importance of a security maturity. So he mentioned that when we started the journey to our security, so we have barely less than 20 analysts, and right now we have 100 analysts, headcount that is manning our security operations center. So it only shows you on the cybersecurity journey on having a basic going to a more adaptive type of a posture. Okay, so with that, I saw some 7 questions already, but let me throw in the first question because I think it's very relevant. Okay, meaning all of you mentioned that zero trust architecture is not a new architecture. It's been existing for quite some time now. But my first question is, how come it takes so long for zero trust to become widespread? I think, meaning Peter, Anton, and the rest, Lee, Tony can respond to this question.
I mean, I can respond to it, I guess, from a customer perspective, since I'm actually on the receiving end of the fence, right? That we actually are the ones that also, try to implement these things as a customer and purchase these things. And I think it was Lee that mentioned that, very early on, is that sure, it's an old concept, even goes beyond Google, back to the military days back in the US, but it's only really now that it is becoming more of, I guess, productized in a way that it's actually easier to do, right? Back then it was very difficult, right? Like, how do you do contextual authentication for devices, whether that's east, west, or north, south, right? Like, how do you even link that with, authentication from a user perspective, so on and so forth. So conceptually, it was good because, I mean, it is, almost a very basic, I would say, security or military concept. But now is the only time that, products such as, whether that's from Checkpoint or Zscaler, makes it almost like a one-click deployment. I think, the really they're not so much of the resurgence, but the impact of how cloud computing and how cloud makes it easier for a lot of these technologies and concepts to be deployed better, I think is what makes it so that, now is, if ever there was a time to do zero trust, now would be it. Because like I've been trying to do it for the past 4 or 5 years and it was so difficult. Like I wish some of these products that are now on the market, the ones that, the products that we have partnered with were there when we were starting our journey, because it would have saved us a lot of headaches for sure.
Maybe I'll take a turn at a different perspective. So first of all, what an amazing group, and I've learned quite a bit just listening to you guys. Made me wonder what I was doing here. But Anton, thank you, always supporting the Globe Business, and Lee also, and Tony. So really insightful stuff. But maybe I'd like to, the two things that I picked up that I thought was quite interesting, and being the more commercial guy and non-technical guy in the room, you might expect this from me. I did appreciate Anton's, I like the way he used the word balance. And I like also the citing that it's the zero trust architecture has shifted around the focus on the customer. And maybe I think from my perspective on the commercial side, all of this is fairly new. I mean, Facebook only started in 2004, so that's like only 16 years ago, and I think Google was late 90s. So I think the adoption and the pace at which digital transformation is just happening so quickly, and I would probably center on the customer, right? Because everybody is now expecting a digital customer experience. And so that means being ubiquitous, that means being personalized, that means being fast and being mobile. So I think it's those elements that's totally disrupted the concept of what was defined as the perimeter before. And I love this Zscaler presentation about how, not just the castle and the people in the castle are all in the cloud. So I think it's been totally disrupted. And if you're going to provide, if as a company, you're going to provide a digital experience to your end customer, your backend also has to be digital, right? So I think you're exposed end to end. And I think that's, been the catalyst of invention of these new capabilities that Anton talks about, that, it's as the technology changes, you can do so much more than you could before. But I do want to emphasize that I think it started with just the whole customer experience around digital, and that bar continues to get higher and higher, and companies are needing to keep pace to serve those customers, both on the front end and in the back end in their delivery of that digital experience.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Tony. Lee?
Yeah, I guess I can chime in on my experience because it's been interesting. So before Zscaler, I was with another proxy company. And while in those years, I spent 10 years doing proxies there, but and I did work with the Department of Defense in the US on various projects where they were using proxies in forward and reverse. At the time, I wasn't aware really of the concept of zero trust. And then later when I moved to Asia, I was actually working with other governments that wanted to connect, maybe not to the same proxies, but to similar types of proxies that were over there. And they were trying to like manually do zero trust with lots of layers of proxies, and the tech wasn't really there. I mean, the RFCs and things weren't really there to make it happen. It was really, really challenging. I think the things where it started to get more interesting, like what the Jericho Forum probably had the most success is really around a lot of the identity and access management things they proposed that became very real in a more rapid fashion. And that was kind of the linchpin. And it's, you can't do zero trust unless you have identity, and the identity has to be out there in the world. And so we're in a place now today where we have lots of identity options that are in the cloud with Azure and Google and, various SAML solutions. And so, and then providers rolling it out, like Beyond Corp, Google talked about that, but that was internal only when they made the paper. And it was only in the last couple of years that was available to customers for GCP. So yeah, it's only in the last few years that the pieces of the puzzle have come together in a way that enterprises can actually adopt it.
Thanks, Lee. Okay, so there are some basic questions here for Zscaler. I think I can respond to this one. Is there a minimum required number required for Zscaler subscription? Yes. For ZP, it's minimum 200. Okay. How do we cost Zscaler? It's a subscription base based on per user per year. Okay, so that's how it's being costed. Another question here, I think, what Checkpoint and Zscaler can respond to this question is, how do vendors like you look at zero trust differently? So I think we could have Tony to respond to this one.
Yeah, sure. And I guess that's the $1 million question, isn't it? So look, I've been around for a long time doing security, and we know that there's the technology that exists within a company, and then there's the marketing department. And every message you see on billboards at airports as you walk through, when people used to go through airports, it says, yeah, we have the best product, and put our stuff in and you can sleep peacefully at night, nothing will go wrong. But it's really a case of every organization has their core, every vendor has their core strengths. They've got the stuff they've been doing for a long time. They're always sort of doing acquisitions and building stuff on top of that. But I don't think there's any real use case for, unless it's a very small size customer, going into a customer and saying, scrap the 20 different vendors you're using right now and use us for everything. That's a lot of people have tried, and people continue to try, but we know that every organization has their unique strengths and weaknesses and priorities, and they will use a mix of things according to what they feel comfortable with and where the organization needs that protection. So we talk about things like consolidation, and yes, I am a supporter of consolidation, but you're not going to go from a position of, we've got 20 different vendors and now we've got one. You might get it down to maybe 5 to 10, which is a dramatic step forward, big improvement. But where they sort of do things like zero trust differently, it's really how they're embracing the story, where they want to take their products in terms of, future roadmap, and really the use cases they're building around that in terms of protecting customers. Now, that might look like one sort of portal, one service. It could be some individual products. It could be some subscriptions. But really, at the end of the day, it's for the customer to sit down, understand the different vendors, what they're offering, and what really fits for that specific customer at that point in time. I guess that's my take on it.
Thank you, Tony. Okay. Lee, you have anything to add?
Yeah, and I just want to say I fully agree with Tony. I mean, zero trust can get applied to a lot of different things. So you've got, you do have marketing teams looking at it, and they're looking at, how do I apply the concepts of zero trust in different ways with different technology, and it's all valid from that perspective. And you're absolutely, you need to still look at defense in depth. What am I looking at my endpoint level? What am I looking at my gateway level, whether that's in premise or in the cloud? What am I looking at in my data centers? And so you've got to think about all the right technologies at all those different layers. So yeah, that's just what I wanted to add. Okay,
thanks, Lee. I think this one is a very relevant question. Meaning, I think Peter, Anton, or any of you can answer this. Has COVID-19 done anything to push organization towards adopting zero trust? Anton, I think from a user perspective.
I mean, is this question specifically, Marlon, how we adopt it, or?
Yep. has COVID-19 done anything to push organization towards adopting a zero trust?
I mean, for sure. I mean, just because it's mentioned earlier, right? I mean, I think the big challenge right now is, people, companies are getting pushed towards, hey, you know what, you got to enable remote work and sort of think about security later. I mean, I think Tony and Lee also sort of mentioned that, right? And then now people are starting to say, okay, you know what, how do we do that securely? And I think that's where, this whole balance thing comes into play, right? And like I said, the great thing about zero trust is that I think it achieves that. Like I said, I do think it's it's almost a red herring when you say zero trust, because it seems like, oh, there is zero trust, everything has to be locked down and secure. But in fact, zero trust actually makes it easier, to be honest. It makes it simpler because everything is either just almost like pushed out to the DMZ. Everything is on the cloud. As long as you're able to authenticate users, devices, put that contextual authentication, so it is more secure, but at the same time more enabling. Removing that perimeter, I think simplifies a lot of things. But of course, I guess my input from a customer perspective, and I guess to also respond to one of the questions, how does Globe implement it? It's not as rosy for us, right? Like, not everything can be zero trust for us to a degree. So there are some stuff, for example, like a lot of cloud applications, some internal apps that are web-based that, we would like to be able to push out. So we do that. There are still some things, for example, that we do leave behind a traditional VPN type of setup. But of course, can it be done? For sure. So I think it also depends on your threat models, how you guys want to approach it. Some things we just can't put there because they're, we just don't want to bother. But, I do think, yes, right, that, it is being pushed out now, and now is the best time to look at it, especially because it does seem like we're going to be stuck in this new normal for much, much, much longer.
Marlon, if I could add on the business side, so there's this joke going around about, what accelerated your digital transformation. Was it A, the CEO, B, the COO, or C, it was COVID? And for a lot of people, obviously that's the joke, it was COVID. And for us in Globe Business, we helped, I think, over 500 enterprise customers with their work from home initiatives. Globe as a company, I think maybe the interesting one, of course, there's already many people with broadband subscriptions, but there's also a lot of employees, especially in the BPO sector, who didn't. And perhaps as a company, we put out 200,000-ish, home broadband modems out there. And because of the scale in which we had to do it and the pace which we had to do it, a lot of it was over Wi-Fi. And so it posed a lot of challenges, because how do you deploy at that scale? And a lot of this happened in the first 2 weeks. And so I think there are a lot of organizations that if you didn't have a Zscaler and you were stuck with the traditional VPNs, how do you do a couple 100,000 work from homes in a couple of week period? So I think that posed a great challenge, and I think there's some imperfect situations out there. I think the other challenge of work from home compared to working in the office, of course, they can monitor you, see what you're doing. When you're working from home, who knows what people are doing? We saw incidents like, of course, there was a lot of streaming of things you weren't supposed to be streaming. And then when you're working from home, there's other people in your family that could be using, also accessing the line. So I think it posed a lot of challenges. And if it's going to be protracted, which is what we're seeing, I think that's going to put a lot of pressure on organizations to accelerate, being able to draw more insights on how these applications are being used, having access rights, monitoring the types of activities that are happening by the employees and how they're using the network and the apps that are being accessed remotely. So definitely it's accelerated that, and some were more prepared than others.
Yeah, I think very good point, Peter, Anton. I think, meaning I fully agree with Anton, because right now, when you look at the current situation right now with this COVID-19, meaning I can say threat actors are the same, we have the same malwares, TTPs are the same, okay? The only difference is the bait. No? Meaning I just read a couple of weeks ago that Google has been blocking 18 million COVID-19 malicious phishing email, okay, 18 million out of the 240 COVID-19 spam email. So meaning, it really accelerates about having a advanced technology and having a clear visibility of what is happening on your infrastructure. Okay, thank you, Anton. Thanks, Peter. Okay, let's go ahead. Okay, I'm just for Checkpoint and Zscaler. I think this is a very good point. What recommendations can you provide on an organization to start adopting to zero trust? Then there is this question as well. Does VPN and zero trust architecture, can they coexist? So meaning, Tony, Lee, I think Lee, you can start.
Yeah, they can absolutely coexist. And I think this ties to Anton and Peter's comment. You can't just throw out your existing investments. They're there, right? So a lot of the strategies right now are, how do I augment them? What are the use cases? So again, that technology that you have probably wasn't built for 100% of your workforce working from home indefinitely. So a lot of what people are looking at is, okay, well, what are the use cases that putting a user actually on the network is better? And maybe there's certain parts of your business where it's just your whole operational model still requires, you know, the traditional model where you're looking at segmentation, you're putting a user on the network. Leverage that existing investment. Nothing wrong with that, but you're making risk decisions everywhere. But as you're looking at the broader workforce longer term, that's where, you know, as you look at the long-term strategy, where can I reduce costs instead of going and expanding that footprint, expanding my network? You know, BCP, you're looking at, you know, office leases even are things people are considering. Like, how do I reduce a lot of fixed costs when I have people working from home and those fixed costs aren't giving you anything? You can start to look at expanding ZTNA for a lot of the use cases that you didn't really originally build that VPN for, and reducing risk in other ways and reducing costs in other ways.
Thanks, Lee. Tony, any insight?
Yeah, a really good question. In terms of, you know, is VPN compatible with Zero Trust? Yes. And I mean, you know, we continue to do new innovative things around VPN. It's a traditional technology, but there's so many different ways to leverage it. So for example, if you're in the cloud, if you're using Azure, we, you know, connect into your virtual machine scale sets, you can VPN into that and get scalability around that instead of into a physical premise you might own. So there's all sorts of different ways of leveraging technology. But in terms of, you know, how do you make that first step? I think it's a bit of a misnomer trying to tell people this is the first step. You know, every organization, this is the first step in terms of your first step to adopt Zero Trust. My advice would be to consult and to basically get someone to come in, ask some questions, get a very good understanding of your topology, your architecture, basically your business from a technology perspective, and there shed their expertise on, well, based on your environment and where you currently are, this would make the most sense for you. I think for people to try to figure it out themselves, they might be going down a rabbit hole that may or may not be the best. And there's people out there that have been through this before, and to tap into their experience, you're probably getting more value for the tasks you're taking on board.
Thanks, Tony. So another question here, if I already have an endpoint security, is it still necessary to deploy the solution like Zscaler? I said yes, because Zscaler is a cloud security, okay? The Zscaler can replace basic firewall protection service it provides to corporate. Yes, Zscaler, we have a reference that initially Zscaler functioned as a web gateway, then eventually on the next phase, it replaces the basic firewall protection services. But again, it really depends on your architecture. But if you're asking if it can replace basic firewall protection services, yes. Okay. So Lee, I already respond to some of those questions.
Yeah, I guess I can add some color to it. So, you know, can Zscaler replace a firewall? And a lot of what I talked about with Zero Trust and what Zscaler is doing for internet security, a lot of the use cases of a firewall, Zscaler can do in the cloud, right? So when you're talking about, you know, firewalls that were allowing users to connect to the internet, obviously that firewall you had on your premise can't sit in a user's home. So Zscaler is acting as your firewall for that internet connectivity. Likewise, for your applications where you want to apply zero trust, so you're strongly identifying the user, you're identifying a context, you're using the zero trust architecture as your access control and your firewall. So you don't need a traditional firewall for that use case. But you still need firewalls, the various sites and things that maybe your marketing websites and various functions where you need people to connect before you know who they are. Those are still areas where traditional firewalls, traditional data center security makes a lot of sense. So we're not saying we replace firewalls in all use cases, but majority of the use cases when you're talking about a named user connecting to a known service, Zscaler can replace a firewall for many of those use cases.
Yep. Thanks, Lee. I think I still have a very good question here. Peter, I think, and Anton, this is for you guys. How important is it for an organization to consider cybersecurity before undergoing digital transformation? Meaning, how can companies play catch up if security was left as an afterthought? Peter, you want to answer?
Yeah, I'll go first, so I have more content that Anton won't take from me. So I guess, and I learned this from Anton. So I guess you would liken it to building a house, right? So you first would come up, ideally, right? You would come up. We don't just start building a house. You would have a blueprint, and then you would build your house. And I guess the parallel in cybersecurity is now you can at least defend your castle. But I think what's really important to note is now you also have to be able to go on offense, right? So you also have to fight back. And I think the important thing, and I guess the question around is, I don't think it's ever too late, because I think the game is, you have to think about it as as Anton said, it's not a compliance thing. It's a day-to-day, minute-by-minute, second-by-second operational thing. You're in combat, right? You have to, I quote Anton, cut them off at the knees. But what we're seeing in the business side, and that's why I think it'll continue to evolve, so we're moving from a situation in business where I think most companies were thinking around disasters and black swans in a business continuity context. Maybe you have to do something for 2 weeks because of a typhoon, because of a flood, because of a fire or a volcano. I don't think anybody was expecting a global pandemic, right? And I think so what we're hearing now is a move from business continuity into business resiliency. So more permanency in how we think about anticipating all kinds of risks. And so the things that we're hearing and talking to our customers about are more fully integrated digital ecosystems. So e-commerce platform in terms of how you interact with a customer, but also how you fulfill and how you think about logistics and where you get your raw materials. In the manufacturing context, we're seeing a lot more, especially as you have the advent of 5G and IoT, you're gonna have more devices. So we're talking about end users in terms of people. There's also end users, if you will, in terms of IoT devices. So I think the threat landscape will continue to expand, will continue to be integrated. So I think even if you're late, I would get some good advice, and you need to get up to speed, because I think that otherwise should be left behind.
Yeah, I mean, just to, I guess, add to that, to what Peter is saying. I mean, I guess within the Globe story, it did happen at the same time, right? Like, I don't think you can do digital transformation anymore and not do cybersecurity, just because cybersecurity is part of digital transformation, right? Like cybersecurity always has to be that track. So like, even when Globe was doing its, digital transformation, even starting from 5-6 years ago, that started with our, BSS. I mean, security was already part of that journey from that very beginning, right? But I guess to Peter's point, and related to a lot of the things that we've been talking about, is sure, maybe even if not everybody can start from that ideal footing, it is never going to be too late, right? Better to do catch up rather than not do anything at all. And again, given the advent of the cloud, given the advent of all of these things, one touch, one click, so on and so forth, you know what? now is the time actually to probably, it's almost good timing if you're late, just because it's so much easier now, right? Like I said, I can't, you know, stop hinging on that, just because, like I said, when we did our journey 5, 6 years ago, I would say arguably it was harder than it is now, just because I think really it now the technology has caught up so much that it is almost innate in every, digital aspect anyway, or any technology. So, better late than never, as they would say.
Well said, Anton. Thank you very much. Okay, next question. I have to read this question. I think this is for me. We are being asked if we could bundle Zscaler checkpoint appliance with the current Globe Internet subscription. The answer is yes. We're coming up with a product that we will bundle Zscaler checkpoint to our DIA. Okay, so watch out for that. Not only checkpoint and Zscaler, but we will also do bundling of our incident response retainer. So this is something that we want to give to our valuable clients, because as a telco, meaning we are the only vendor that can provide both the service for a service provider and the service for an ICT. The answer is yes. We will have that bundling. Okay, so each of your account managers on the next succeeding days will get in touch with you about this new bundling that we're creating for our enterprise clients. Okay, so so we're running out of time. Last 4 minutes. I think, okay, this last question. Do we have, meaning all of you can answer, the panelists, do we have to start over with our networks as we embark to Zero Trust journey? So what about specific investment that we have made that aren't compatible with the Zero Trust model?
I mean, I guess I can take that on, just because, again, we are still going through that. I guess, the difficulty is, I mean, so yeah, again, as mentioned earlier, you can't just all of a sudden like, hey, you know what, I want to zero trust everything. I mean, like, I ideally, so that is a goal and a target. But of course, I don't think that can be done realistically overnight. So it's really just a matter of looking at what I would like, for example, for us, the way that we approach it, we don't really necessarily look at it from a risk management perspective, but it's, really from a threat model. And at the same time, really a customer business need, right? So, for example, in our case, given that we are in this pandemic, okay, you know what is the immediate business case or use case or customer case, right? And a lot of that is enabling remote work for our existing employees, but at the same time, Globe does outsource a lot of things, whether that's contact centers, back-end operations, so on and so forth. How do we make sure that that particular side of the operations is still running? So I would say that would be the immediate business case. Look at all of the different platforms and applications that are related to that particular side of process and operations, and then start there. And then what, for example, Zscaler, Checkpoint, there's a lot of security features that you can turn on, subscribe to, or bundle or include in that particular deployment. We also now look at our threat models, right? So for example, okay, let's say if it's going to be a contact center where you got an agent that might be, working, even through a zero trust environment, still will be working remotely. So what would be left over as a threat model? If all of the malware stuff are handled by, a Zscaler product or a Checkpoint product, we don't really have great protections over a camera, right? So ensuring, for example, there's watermarking, ensuring, for example, there's a couple of other things that can act as a deterrence, that we use that as a threat model. And then slowly, I would say we would go back. If ever, just the last advice is really, and is what I tell, a lot of other CISOs when I do coaching for them is, as long as you wrap everything within a project management model, that's all it really is, right? It's like, look, have a plan, have a way to execute that plan, and then you'll get there eventually.
I guess I would maybe to build on that, Antona and Marlon, I said maybe my advice would be to look at it more holistically. A lot of times you can just preoccupy with yourself in deciding cost in isolation, but the benefits of it are far more than costs. You might grow faster. What's interesting in some interviews where we've interviewed quite a number of our customers, I would say the current thinking is the average, I would say this average is what we're hearing. 50% work from home long term, right? So what's happened is your P&L has changed. Your cost structure of your business model has changed. So maybe you're not spending as much on your rent and utilities and your occupancy costs, but that would then shift, right? Maybe now you can, you know, try to do things, put more things on the cloud, do more of the cybersecurity projects you wanted. So my advice would be to look at it more holistically, look at the other business benefits that you gain, and not look at it in terms of just a cost play in isolation.
Thanks, Peter. So I think that wraps up our session for today. On a closing note, before I hand it over to Janice, I think it's very critical for us to think that when we move to zero trust, meaning it's divide and rule, meaning we have to identify our assets. We have to define a micro segmentation and create multiple junctions and inspection points. Okay? I think I like what Anton had mentioned. Today, technology strategy dictates the business strategy. So security is not just a footnote of a business plan. So I think we have to be prepared. We need to be more on the adaptive cybersecurity because we need to have those capabilities before we even need them. So with that, I hand it over to Janice for the raffle. Okay, so Janice, thank you.
Anton, maybe tell everybody there. I know there are a lot more questions, so that we should we'll try to answer them and send them to the participants.
Yeah.
After the fact.
Yeah, so that's fine. Like, I mean, I think you guys can just you know, bundle that all up, and you know, maybe we can send it over through email or something similar.
Yep, thank you. We will do that. Thank you, Marlon, and again to all our speakers. Thank you so much, Anton, Peter, Lee, and Tony. And thank you everyone for spending your Thursday morning with us, and we hope that you learned a lot from our experts. But please don't go yet. As mentioned by Marlon, we have raffle, so we now go to the most exciting part, which is the raffle.
I think you have to feed your dog.
I'm so sorry. So we have electronic giveaway cards for you, which you can use in partner establishments like restaurants, retail shops, and different lifestyle stores. And for the first batch, we will be giving away 1,500 peso voucher codes for 10 winners. So let's go now. Julian. Okay, first winner is Brian Palay. Okay, we now go to the next. We'll just do this quickly. Second winner is Miss Sheila Quiñones. Next. Third winner is Mel Gazar Saligumba. Next. Fourth is Mr. Leonard Diaz. Okay, next. Fifth is Mr. John Paul Almario. Next. Next is Mr. Rani Velasco. Next. We have John Francis Lictao. I think we have 3 more. Miss Marian Agustin. Okay, 2 more. We have Jaime Laguyo. And then last for this batch, so sorry for all that noise, Mr. Alex Opida. Congratulations, guys. We will send later the instructions on how you can claim your prize. So next we have 5 gift certificates worth 2,500. Okay. First winner is Mr. Raymond Parungao. Second winner is Miss Joan Kate Limos. Third winner is Mr. Adrian Villegas. Fourth winner is Mr. Rob Dizon. And last winner is Lahiru Monindradasa. Sorry, I hope I pronounced that right. Congrats, guys. Okay, don't go yet because we have more. Now we will be choosing 5 winners for gift certificates at Nike for 2,000 pesos each. Okay, let's go. First winner is by the way, this is from Checkpoint, so thank you again, Checkpoint. Mr. Rufel Aganan. Second winner is Justin Banag. Third is Von Dakudao. Fourth is Ryan John Bernabe. Okay, and last is Vonel Isip. Okay. Now we're choosing one winner. So this is the last item. One winner for a 5,000 peso gift certificate at Nike, also courtesy of Checkpoint. Thank you, Checkpoint. Go. J. Mac Mantala. Okay, congratulations, everyone. So, to claim your prize, kindly email Miss Jonna Mananghaya. You can see her email address on the screen, and send her your mobile phone, your name and details so you can claim your voucher. Okay. Again, on behalf of Globe, I would like to thank everyone for joining us this morning, and we would appreciate if you could answer the feedback form that you will see after you exit. So there's a QR code there. So there. Thank you again, and enjoy the rest of the day.